The evening breeze whispered through the century-old oaks that stood guard over Whitmore Manor like silent sentinels of time. Golden leaves danced in the air, casting playful shadows across the white marble of the main entrance. A year had passed since those mahogany doors last opened, to welcome the most distinguished guest ever to grace these floors, Richard Blackstone, the oil magnate whose fortune rivaled the great financial empires of the world. Now, beneath September's golden light, his silver Rolls-Royce glided down the gravel path like an apparition from the past. The manor's staff, who had maintained their routines for months, felt a collective shiver when the unmistakable purr of the luxury engine shattered the evening silence. Margaret, the head housekeeper, dropped the porcelain cup she was holding. Stevens, the butler, nervously adjusted his bow tie, and in the kitchen, the maids exchanged glances, heavy with secrets that had remained buried like cursed treasures for an entire year. But there was someone else in that mansion, someone whose heart pounded with the force of 1,000 African drums upon hearing that engine that had marked the end of her innocence and the beginning of her motherhood. Amara Washington had changed. No longer was she the shy 18-year-old who cleaned windows with trembling hands and kept her eyes downcast in the presence of her employers. A year of raising a child alone had transformed her gaze into tempered steel, had straightened her back like a Maasai spear, had turned her delicate hands into sanctuaries of unbreakable tenderness. The automobile stopped before the marble steps with the precision of a familiar ritual. Richard Blackstone emerged from the Italian leather interior like a ghost returning to face the demons of his past. His 52 years had grown heavier during these months. The silver threads at his temples told stories of sleepless nights, of business decisions that faded before the face of a woman he couldn't forget. His $3,000 Armani suit couldn't hide the restlessness that gnawed at his soul like rust devours iron. The staff lined up in the main foyer like soldiers before their general, but something was different in the atmosphere. Whispers that cut off abruptly, evasive glances, forced smiles that never reached their eyes. Richard sensed the tension like a predator smells fear in its prey. During the first days of his previous stay, he had been the perfect guest, courteous, distant, focused solely on the business that had brought him to this rural property. But something had changed on that final night, something that had haunted him for 365 days like a hungry shadow. Where is she? He wondered, while his eyes scrutinized every corner of the foyer, every step of the curved staircase, every reflection in the gilded mirrors. He didn't dare speak her name, but his heart screamed Amara with each beat. He had searched discreetly among the familiar faces, but she wasn't there. Had she fled? Had they dismissed her? Or was she simply avoiding him as he had tried to avoid her memories all this time? Friends, if this story is striking deep chords in your heart, if you feel emotions embracing you like wind embraces leaves, then you need to stay until the end. Subscribe to this channel because what you're about to discover could forever change how you see love, truth, and redemption. There are secrets buried in this mansion that are about to come to light, and I promise the conclusion will leave you breathless. Stevens, the butler with 40 years of impeccable service, approached with measured steps across the polished marble. His face, normally a map of professional serenity, showed barely perceptible cracks of nervousness. "Mr. Blackstone," he murmured with practiced deference, "it's an honor to have you back at Whitmore Manor. Your room is prepared exactly as you prefer it." But Richard wasn't listening to the protocol words. His mind was a whirlwind of fragmented images, ebony skin beneath moonlight, eyes like pools of liquid honey, whispers in the darkness that promised eternity and vanished with dawn. He had come to close the circle, to confront what he had left incomplete, to seek answers to questions that tormented him like thorns embedded in his conscience. Whitmore Manor seemed to guard its secrets within cedar walls and Persian tapestries. Each room whispered stories of furtive encounters, forbidden passions, loves that defied social conventions. And somewhere in that architectural vastness, Amara Washington was raising alone a child who carried in his veins the blood of two irreconcilable worlds, the golden opulence of power and the silent dignity of resistance. Destiny had woven its web for an entire year, and now all threads converged at this moment, at this return that promised revelations capable of shaking the foundations of everything Richard believed he knew about himself. Truth awaited him like a storm on the horizon, beautiful and terrible at once, ready to transform him or destroy him in the attempt. Night had fallen over the mansion like a black velvet mantle bordered with stars. 12 months ago, on a night identical to this one, two lonely souls had collided in the silent corridors of Whitmore Manor, like lost meteorites in the vastness of space, creating an explosion of light that still reverberated in their wounded hearts. Richard had arrived that night exhausted by weeks of brutal negotiations in Europe. His oil empire was teetering before new environmental regulations, and shareholders demanded miraculous results that seemed unattainable. Whitmore Manor was his secret refuge, the place where he could shed the armor of power and allow himself the dangerous luxury of being simply human. It was past midnight when the demons of insomnia expelled him from his bed. He wandered the corridors like a lost soul, his bare feet whispering over Persian rugs when he saw her. Amara stood in the library, before the window overlooking the gardens, her silhouette outlined against the silver light of the full moon. She wore a white cotton nightgown that enveloped her like a cloud, and her curly hair cascaded over her bare shoulders like a waterfall of black silk. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered from the shadows, but his voice betrayed more vulnerability than authority. She turned slowly, and for the first time in months Richard found himself looking directly into another human being's eyes, without the protective barrier of his social position. They were eyes of honey melted under fire, eyes that had seen too much pain for their young age, eyes that stripped him bare with brutal honesty. "Neither should you, Mr. Blackstone," Amara responded with a voice like distant violin music. There was no submission in her tone, but an equality that completely disarmed him. But sometimes loneliness leads us to forbidden places. The air between them charged with static electricity, with all the unspoken words that floated like nocturnal butterflies among the shelves of ancient books. Richard approached slowly, hypnotized by the magnetic force emanating from this woman-child who should have been invisible to him, but who had become the gravitational center of his thoughts. "What are you reading?" he asked, though his eyes already knew the answer. In her delicate hands, Amara held a copy of Wuthering Heights, pages marked by years of clandestine readings by candlelight. "Emily Bronte," he murmured, surprised. "A story of impossible love." "Like all true stories," she replied, closing the book slowly. "Possible loves are boring, Mr. Blackstone. They're predictable. The impossible ones, those burn like flames that consume everything in their path." Those words were the spark that ignited the fire. Without words, without preambles, without the ceremonies of civilized courtship, they found each other in the space that separated their worlds. Richard's lips found Amara's with the desperation of a drowning man discovering a bubble of oxygen. She responded with the contained passion of years of invisibility, of serving in silence while her soul screamed to be seen, to be desired, to be loved. The library became their secret cathedral. Among first editions and illuminated manuscripts, they wrote their own story with caresses that defied 3 centuries of racial prejudice and 5 millennia of class differences. He discovered in her a fierce intellectuality hidden beneath the servant's uniform. She found in him the wounded child hiding behind the facade of the merciless magnate. "My father abandoned me when I was 5, Richard confessed, while his fingers traced invisible constellations on Amara's ebony skin. "My mother married a man who saw me as an investment, not a son. I built this empire to prove to them I could be someone without their love, but each success makes me feel emptier." "Mine died in the mines when I was 8, she responded, her voice a whisper laden with centuries of inherited pain. "My mother cleaned houses until her knees couldn't support her anymore. She taught me that dignity isn't measured in dollars, but in the ability to keep your head high no matter who looks down on you." That night they forged a bond that transcended flesh and reached the deepest regions of the soul. But when dawn painted the sky rose and gold, reality imposed itself like an implacable executioner. Richard had to leave that morning. Business wouldn't wait, shareholders didn't forgive, the outside world knew no pause. He dressed in silence while Amara watched him from the improvised bed among leather cushions. They didn't say goodbye, because both knew that farewells make definitive what should remain eternal. He left as he had arrived, in his silver Rolls-Royce, taking with him the heart of a woman who had known true love for a single night. Amara didn't tell him she already suspected she carried in her womb the fruit of that sacred union. She didn't confess that she had decided to protect that secret, like a lioness protects her cub. She simply let him leave, knowing that someday destiny would reunite them again, or separate them forever. But true love leaves seeds that germinate in darkness and bloom against all odds. And that seed was already growing in Amara Washington's womb, destined to become the bridge between two worlds that had remained separated for too long. The present struck Richard like a blast of Arctic air when Stevens guided him to his presidential suite. Everything was exactly the same: the damask silk curtains, the hand-carved canopy bed, the walnut desk where he had signed million-dollar contracts. But there was something different in the atmosphere, an underground current of whispers and evasive glances that put him on maximum alert. During dinner, served in the main dining room under the light of bohemian crystal chandeliers, Richard observed with surgical attention every movement of the staff. Margaret, the housekeeper, avoided his direct gaze, and startled when he addressed her. Old Thompson, the gardener, who used to tell him amusing stories about the former owner's antics, now limited himself to nervous monosyllabic nods. But it was Amara's absence that most disturbed him. During his previous visit, she had been a constant, though silent, presence, serving tea with elegant grace, changing sheets with invisible efficiency, maintaining the rose gardens in immaculate perfection. Now it was as if the earth had swallowed her, leaving only the ghostly echo of her crystalline laughter in the empty corridors. "Stevens," Richard called after dessert, his voice loaded with an authority that admitted no evasions. "Where is Miss Washington? I haven't seen her since my arrival." The butler went rigid as a pillar of salt. His eyes, trained for decades not to reveal family secrets, blinked with a frequency that betrayed his internal nervousness. "Miss Washington, has been reassigned to night duties, sir. Deep cleaning of unoccupied rooms. She rarely coincides with guest schedules." It was a lie, polished like ancient silver, but a lie nonetheless. Richard knew it by the way Stevens adjusted his bow tie 3 times during the explanation. A nervous tic he had observed in business meetings when partners tried to hide devastating losses. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He paced his suite like a caged tiger, his mind weaving increasingly disturbing theories. Had he done something inappropriate that night that caused her dismissal? Had they discovered her in the library and punished her transgression? Or was there something more, something the staff knew but conspired to keep hidden? At 3 a.m, he ventured outside his room with the stealth of a thief in his own house. The corridors of Whitmore Manor seemed different in darkness, longer, more sinister, full of shadows that whispered secrets. He followed the familiar path to the library, hoping to find her there as a year ago, hoping that time was a perfect circle that would give them a second chance. But the library was empty, silent as a tomb. Only the books witnessed his desolation as he wandered the shelves where he had discovered that Amara was much more than a servant. She was a soulmate disguised as domestic help. It was then he heard it, a soft cry, almost musical, that floated from some remote place in the mansion like the echo of a lullaby. His heart stopped. He knew that sound from his own blurred childhood memories. It was the cry of a baby. He followed the sound like a hypnotized man, his bare feet sliding over cold marble. The crying guided him through corridors he had never explored, service stairs connecting levels destined for family with those reserved for staff. With each step the sound became clearer, more real, more impossible to ignore. He stopped before a simple wooden door without ornaments, marked only with the number 7. The bronze plate read, "Staff Room." The crying came from inside, now accompanied by a female voice singing a lullaby in a language he recognized as Yoruba, the African words wrapped in a melody that spoke of maternal love and ancestral protection. Richard pressed his ear to the door, barely breathing. The voice was unmistakably Amara's, but there was something different about it. A new maturity, a strength she hadn't possessed a year ago. She sang with the wisdom of mothers who have faced the world alone, with the determination of women who have transformed vulnerability into fortitude. The crying gradually ceased, replaced by soft cooing and the rhythmic sound of an old rocking chair. Richard stepped away from the door with his heart beating so loud he feared it could be heard from inside. His legs trembled as he returned to his suite, his mind struggling to process what he had discovered. A baby. There was a baby in Whitmore Manor, a baby that Amara cared for with a mother's devotion. But whose child was it? Had she found love in another man's arms after his departure? Or could it be possible that... The possibility struck him like lightning splitting an oak. Numbers danced in his head. Exactly 1 year and 2 months had passed since that night in the library. 1 year and 2 months, the perfect time for a nocturnal encounter to become a new life. He returned to his room transformed. He was no longer the oil magnate who had arrived that afternoon seeking to close a cycle from the past. Now he was a man on the edge of an emotional abyss, facing the possibility that he had left more than memories at Whitmore Manor. He had left a part of himself growing in the womb of the only woman who had managed to touch his soul. Dawn found him awake, looking out the window toward the gardens where Amara used to work. He needed answers. He needed the truth. He needed to look into that child's eyes to confirm or banish the suspicions that consumed him like acid. Because if that baby was his, everything would change. His life, his priorities, his future, his very concept of what it meant to be a complete man. And for the first time in decades, Richard Blackstone felt he was about to face the most important decision of his existence. The following day dawned grey as molten lead, with heavy clouds presaging a storm. Richard had spent the night planning his strategy like a general before the decisive battle. He needed to see that child, needed confirmation or denial of his suspicions, but had to proceed with the caution of a diplomat in mined territory. During breakfast, he observed every movement of the staff with the intensity of a hunting hawk. He noticed how Margaret served an additional tray that quickly disappeared toward the staff stairs. He saw how Thompson, the gardener, carried fresh flowers not toward the main dining room, but toward the service quarters. Small details that painted the portrait of someone special being cared for in secret. "Stevens," Richard said with studied casualness while folding his Irish linen napkin, "I'd like to tour the entire property this morning. It's been some time since my last visit, and I want to ensure everything is in perfect condition." The butler paled slightly. "Of course, Mr. Blackstone. Any particular area that interests you?" "All of them," Richard replied, his tone brooking no discussion, "including the staff quarters. As temporary owner of this property, it's my responsibility to guarantee that everyone living here has appropriate conditions." The terror in Stevens's eyes was so fleeting it would have gone unnoticed by anyone less trained than Richard in reading micro-expressions during multi-million-dollar negotiations. But he caught it like a shark smells blood in water. They began the tour through the main gardens, but Richard paid little attention to explanations about new rose varieties or the renovated irrigation system. His mind was focused on the final objective, the staff quarters in the east wing where he had heard the crying the previous night. It was Margaret who finally made the mistake Richard had been waiting for. As they crossed the foyer, a young employee approached running with a worried expression. "Mrs. Margaret," she whispered without noticing Richard's presence, "the little one has a fever. Amara is very worried and asks if she can call the doctor." The silence that followed was so dense it could have been cut with a knife. Margaret went white as wax. Stevens closed his eyes as if receiving his death sentence, and the young employee realized too late the mortal error she had committed. "The little one?" Richard asked with dangerously soft voice. It wasn't a question. It was the key that had just opened all the secret doors of Whitmore Manor. Margaret attempted a desperate recovery. It's the son of one of the employees, sir. A temporary situation while she finds other accommodation." But Richard was no longer listening. He had heard everything he needed to know. Without waiting for permission, he headed toward the staff stairs with long, determined steps, followed by Stevens and Margaret, who murmured pleas and desperate explanations. He climbed the steps 2 at a time, his heart pumping pure adrenaline. The staff corridor was narrow and functional, very different from the spacious, luxurious areas destined for guests. The doors were marked with simple numbers, and he headed directly to number 7, like a missile toward its target. He stopped before the door, panting not from physical effort but from the emotional enormity of the moment. From inside came soft voices. Amara, speaking in consoling tones and a feverish child's response, small complaints that awakened in Richard protective instincts he didn't know he possessed. He raised his hand to knock but stopped. Once he knocked on that door, there would be no turning back. Once he saw that child, his life would change irrevocably, regardless of what he discovered on the other side. Margaret arrived running behind him, gasping, "Mr. Blackstone, please allow me to explain." But Richard had already knocked. 3 soft, almost timid knocks. Total silence took over the interior, as if time itself had held its breath. "Come in," came Amara's voice from inside, cautious but firm. She hadn't recognized the specific way of knocking. Richard turned the golden doorknob and pushed the door gently. What he saw on the other side broke his heart and rebuilt it at the same time in the space of a heartbeat. The room was small but impeccably organized, decorated with the elegant simplicity of someone who finds beauty in functionality. A light wood crib occupied the corner by the window, where natural light could bathe its small occupant during daylight hours. And there, sitting in a rocking chair that seemed inherited from ancestral generations, was Amara Washington, holding in her arms a child of approximately 9 months. The world stopped for Richard Blackstone in that instant. The child had skin of perfect caramel tone, as if coffee with milk had found its ideal balance between 2 worlds. But it was the eyes that struck him like a punch to the soul, emerald green identical to his own, with that same penetrating intensity he had inherited from his paternal grandfather. The baby's curls were black as midnight, but had that specific texture Richard recognized from his own childhood photographs. "My God," he whispered, and his voice broke like fine crystal against stone. Amara looked at him with a mixture of defiance and vulnerability that reminded him of a lioness protecting her cub. She had stood slowly, rocking the child against her chest, and in her liquid honey eyes Richard saw confirmation, terror, hope, and a strength that hadn't been there a year ago. "His name is David," she said, with a voice clear as crystal bell. "David Washington Blackstone, though only I know the second part of his surname." The name hit him like a revelation. David, like his grandfather, the only man who had shown true affection for Richard during his lonely childhood. She had known somehow, had chosen that name as a bridge between past and future, between memory and hope. "Why?" asked Richard, and that simple word contained 1,000 questions. Why hadn't she told him? Why had she kept the secret? Why had she faced pregnancy and childbirth alone? Why had she protected his son from a father who had the right to know of his existence? Amara's eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. "Because you left without looking back. Because we are different worlds that only touched for one night. Because a white millionaire doesn't need the problems that would come from acknowledging a mixed-race son with a black servant." Each word was a precise stab to Richard's conscience, because he knew in the deepest part of his soul that she was right. The Richard of a year ago would have seen this child as a complication, an obstacle to his ambitions, a potential scandal that could destroy his carefully constructed reputation. But the man standing in that humble room, looking into his son's green eyes, was no longer the same. Something had died in him during these months of aimless searching for a purpose that always slipped through his fingers like sand. And something new was being born now, nourished by a truth he couldn't deny or ignore. "Can I touch him?" he asked with hoarse voice, extending trembling hands toward the child who carried his blood and his gaze. Amara hesitated for an eternal moment. In that pause, Richard felt the weight of all past sins, all unearned privileges, all moments when he had chosen convenience over justice. But he also felt something more, the possibility of redemption, the opportunity to be the father he himself had never had. Slowly, as if she were surrendering her very soul, Amara brought the child closer to Richard. David looked at him with that unfiltered curiosity that only babies possess, without prejudices about skin color or bank account size. To him, Richard was simply another human being, potentially interesting, potentially trustworthy. When Richard's fingers touched David's soft cheek, he felt as if an electric current ran through his entire body. This was his son, his blood, his legacy. All the money in the world, all the oil wells, all properties and investments paled before the simple and absolute reality of this small life he had helped create. "He has a fever," Amara murmured, breaking the spell of the moment. "We'll call the best pediatrician in the region," Richard responded immediately, his paternal instinct awakening with primitive force. "No, we'll call 3. We'll do everything necessary." It was the first decision he made as a father, and he felt it as the most important of his entire life. The news spread through Whitmore Manor like wildfire in dry grass. Before noon, every employee knew that Mr. Blackstone had discovered David's existence, and that the child was ill. Tension in the air was so thick it could be cut with a knife, as they waited to see what the millionaire would do with this explosive information. But the Whitmore family, actual owners of the mansion and Amara's official employers, took less than 24 hours to learn of the scandal developing under their roof. The call came like a death sentence. They would be at the property that very afternoon to handle the situation appropriately. Eleanor Whitmore was a 72-year-old matron whose ancestral fortune competed with Richard's new wealth. She had built her life on the unshakable pillars of tradition, propriety, and established social order. The idea that her property had been the scene of an interracial affair that had produced a bastard child filled her with indignation bordering on apoplexy. She arrived accompanied by her son Harrison, a 45-year-old man whose mediocrity had been compensated with an extra dose of inherited prejudices, and Marcus Reed, the family lawyer, a man thin as a razor and twice as sharp. "This is intolerable," Eleanor declared from the moment she set foot in the main foyer, her ivory cane striking the marble like a judge's gavel. "A servant who seduces our most distinguished guest and then blackmails with a bastard. It's exactly the type of behavior we would expect." Richard, who had spent the last hours beside David's crib while the doctor arrived, felt a cold, calculated fury ascend his spine. "I suggest you measure your next words very carefully, Mrs. Whitmore." "Don't threaten me, Blackstone," Eleanor retorted, her steel blue eyes glinting with aristocratic contempt. "This girl has violated every term of her employment. Seducing guests is strictly prohibited in our contracts. She will be dismissed immediately, and the child will be handed over to social services where it belongs." "That child," Richard said with dangerously soft voice, "is my son. And if anyone tries to separate him from his mother, they'll discover exactly what kind of enemy a man with unlimited resources can be." Marcus Reed cleared his throat nervously. As a lawyer, he knew Richard's reputation in courts. He had destroyed entire legal empires when his interests were at stake. "Mr. Blackstone, we understand this must be emotionally confusing, but we must consider practical realities: a paternity test, custody issues, public scandal." "The only reality that matters to me," Richard interrupted, "is that there's a sick child upstairs who needs his father, and a mother who has raised my son alone for 9 months because I was too cowardly to face the consequences of my actions." Harrison Whitmore, who had remained silent, accumulating liquid courage from the whiskey bottle in his jacket's inner pocket, finally exploded. "Consequences? You call consequences having a calculating black woman use her son as a lottery ticket? Please, we all know how these situations work." The silence that followed was so absolute that the air itself seemed to freeze. Richard turned slowly toward Harrison, and in his green eyes was a coldness that had frozen entire boardrooms during crucial negotiations. "Say that again," he said with black velvet voice. "Please. I want to make sure I heard correctly before deciding how to respond." But it was Amara who broke the tension. She had come down the stairs unnoticed, carrying David wrapped in a light blue blanket. Her presence filled the foyer with a dignity that no noble title could equal. "I don't need defense," she said, looking directly into Eleanor Whitmore's eyes. "I've worked in this house for 2 years. I've cleaned every room, served every meal, tended every garden with honesty and dedication. My son is not a shame or a mistake. He's the consequence of genuine love between 2 adults who found each other when they needed it most." Her voice didn't tremble. Her hands didn't shake. She stood there, a 20-year-old woman facing the region's most powerful elite, and showed not an ounce of intimidation. "And if you consider my presence here inappropriate," she continued, "then we'll leave." David and I have lived with less before, and we can do it again. But I won't allow anyone to call him a bastard or treat his existence as if it were a stain to be cleaned." Eleanor Whitmore looked at her with a mixture of contempt and involuntary admiration. In her world of inherited privileges and purchased submission, she had rarely encountered that type of genuine strength. "Very noble," she said with venomous sarcasm. "But nobility doesn't pay bills or provide education. What future can you offer that child? A life of poverty to satisfy your pride?" It was then that Richard made the decision that would define the rest of his life. "The future I'm going to offer him," he said, walking until he stood beside Amara, "includes the best available medical care, the best possible education, and something no money can buy, a father who loves him unconditionally." He put his arm around Amara's shoulders, and for the first time in his life he felt he was exactly where he should be. "And if anyone in this room has any problem with that," he added, looking directly into each of the Whitmore's eyes, "I suggest they consult with their lawyers before deciding if they really want to become my enemies." War had been declared, and for the first time in decades, Richard Blackstone was fighting for something that truly mattered. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal confrontations, furious phone calls, and power maneuvers that extended from rural mansions to Wall Street skyscrapers. Eleanor Whitmore had gravely underestimated the determination of a man who had found something worth fighting for beyond money. Richard hired the most prestigious legal firm from 3 different states, not to attack, but to protect. He established educational trusts, arranged private medical care, and most importantly began the process of legal paternity recognition that would give David all rights as his heir. But legal battles were only the surface of a much deeper transformation occurring in Richard Blackstone's soul. Each day spent with his son, each night helping Amara with parenting responsibilities, each smile David gave him without knowing his financial importance, changed him in ways he hadn't believed possible. He began remembering forgotten fragments of his own childhood, how he had dreamed of having a father who would play with him, who would read him bedtime stories, who would hold him when nightmares woke him in the early morning. He had built an empire trying to fill that void, but now he understood that the only way to heal it was ensuring David never experienced that absence. Nights at Whitmore Manor became his emotional university. He learned to change diapers with the meticulousness he once reserved for reviewing million-dollar contracts. He discovered that making David laugh with funny faces provided satisfaction no corporate acquisition had achieved. He understood that fatherhood wasn't a title one buys, but a privilege earned minute by minute, day by day. "I never thought I'd see the most feared oil magnate in the country singing lullabies at 3 in the morning, Amara told him one night while watching him rock David after a nighttime feeding session. Richard smiled, a genuine expression that had been absent from his face for years. "Neither did I. But it turns out there are things more important than oil prices." "How is your family taking all this?" Amara asked, though her tone suggested she already intuited the answer. Richard's smile faded. His mother, Elizabeth Blackstone, had cut all communication after learning of the scandal. His stepsister, Victoria, had been more direct in her condemnation, threatening to withdraw her support from his philanthropic initiatives if he didn't handle the situation discreetly. His main company's partners were nervous about public relations implications. "My real family is in this room," he finally responded. "The rest are just people who share my surname and my bank accounts." But external pressure was intensifying. Media had caught rumors of the scandal, and although Richard had managed to keep details off the front pages, he knew it was only a matter of time before the story exploded publicly. The Whitmores were deliberately feeding gossip, hoping public shame would force Richard to abandon his romantic ideas and return to his previous life. The crisis reached its peak when Marcus Reed appeared at Whitmore Manor with a proposal that made the air itself seem poisonous. "We've consulted with crisis management experts," he announced with the satisfaction of a cat that has caught a mouse. "There exists a solution that protects the interests of all parties involved." He spread a folder full of legal documents on the main dining room's mahogany table. Richard reviewed them with decades of experience reading complex contracts and felt nausea overcome him with each paragraph. "A perpetual confidentiality agreement," he read aloud. substantial financial compensation for Miss Washington, establishment of an educational fund for the minor, and in exchange neither party may ever reveal the nature of the relationship or publicly claim paternity. It was a generous offer in monetary terms, enough money for Amara and David to live comfortably for the rest of their lives, education at the best private institutions, premium medical care. Everything any single mother could want for her child. Except one thing, the truth. It's a very reasonable proposal, Reed continued. Mr. Blackstone can continue with his life without scandals. The child will receive all economic benefits of his lineage without social complications, and Miss Washington will be generously compensated for her contribution. The silence in the room was so dense it seemed to have physical weight. Amara had paled while reading over Richard's shoulder, perfectly understanding what was being offered. A golden life in exchange for her dignity, economic security in exchange for keeping David as a dirty secret. We've even arranged a position at a private university, Reed added, where Miss Washington could complete her education while David attends campus daycare. An extraordinary opportunity for someone in her situation. It was then that Richard fully understood the depth of his transformation. The man he had been a year ago would have seen this proposal as the perfect solution. It protected his reputation, provided care for his son, and resolved the problem cleanly and efficiently. But the father who had emerged during these weeks of sleepless nights and mornings, filled with infantile smiles, saw the proposal for what it really was: an offer to buy silence about his son's existence, to convert David into a secret paid monthly instead of a legacy celebrated publicly. Slowly, meticulously, Richard took each page of the contract and tore them one by one. The sound of paper tearing filled the room like rifle shots. "My response," he said with voice clear as mountain crystal, "is that I would rather lose every penny I own than pretend my son doesn't exist." He turned toward Amara, and in his eyes she saw something that hadn't been there during their first night together: absolute certainty. "David will legally carry my surname. He will be my public and recognized heir, and anyone who has problems with that can prepare for the battle of their lives." It was his declaration of war against a world that wanted to keep love hidden in shadows, and for the first time since discovering David's existence, Richard felt completely at peace with his decisions. The decision was made, but the path to its implementation would be more difficult than Richard had anticipated. The tentacles of established power extended deeper than he had imagined, and the Whitmores had allies in places he had gravely underestimated. The first retaliation came in the form of a routine tax audit of all his major companies. Simultaneously, 3 of his most important partners received irresistible offers to sell their stakes to competitors Richard recognized as fronts for enemies he had accumulated during decades of ruthless business. "They're using every trick in the book," his chief attorney explained during an emergency video conference. "Nothing illegal, but they're applying pressure from every possible angle. They want you to see exactly how much maintaining your position will cost." But Richard had underestimated something crucial: the transformative power of paternal love. Each attack on his businesses, each attempt to isolate him socially, each veiled threat only strengthened his resolve. He had found something more valuable than his entire financial empire, and no external pressure could make him renounce it. The second phase of the war began when Eleanor Whitmore played what she considered her winning card: a lawsuit questioning Amara's fitness as a mother, based on evidence that she had deliberately seduced Richard as part of a long-term blackmail scheme. It was a monstrous accusation, designed not only to gain custody of David, but to destroy Amara's reputation so that no future court could see her as an appropriate maternal figure. The Whitmore's lawyers had built a case that painted Amara as a calculating manipulator, who had used her position as domestic help to set a trap for the mansion's wealthiest guest. "It's brilliant in its malice," Richard's attorney reluctantly admitted. "They've taken the fact that she never revealed the pregnancy and turned it into evidence of hidden intentions. They argue that if it had truly been genuine love, she would have contacted the child's father immediately." Richard felt a fury that went beyond anything he had experienced in the most competitive boardrooms. It wasn't just that they were attacking Amara, they were attacking the authenticity of the love they had shared, converting the most beautiful night of his life into something sordid and calculated. But Amara's response was what surprised him most. Instead of breaking under pressure, she seemed to grow stronger with each attack. The woman he had known as a timid servant had transformed into a warrior, defending not only her son, but the very truth of what they had lived together. "Let them come," she told Richard one night while reviewing the legal documents that accumulated like autumn leaves. "Let them bring all their expensive lawyers and private investigators. Let them examine every moment of my life under a magnifying glass. Truth is truth, and they can't change it with money or influence." Her strength inspired him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had built his career being more ruthless than his enemies, more calculating than his competitors, colder than those who tried to destroy him. But Amara was teaching him a different type of power, the strength that comes from fighting for justice instead of profit, the energy that arises from protecting love instead of accumulating wealth. The legal battle intensified for weeks, with each side presenting increasingly sophisticated evidence, testimonies, and arguments. The Whitmores had hired investigators who had excavated every moment of Amara's life, searching for anything that could be used to paint a portrait of a morally questionable woman. What they found, to their frustration, was exactly the opposite. High school teachers who remembered Amara as an exceptional student who had worked nights and weekends to help support her family. Previous employers who testified to her impeccable honesty and exemplary work ethic. Neighbors who spoke of a young woman who had cared for younger siblings while her mother worked double shifts. "Her life is an open book," Marcus Reed reported frustratedly during a Whitmore strategy meeting. "No scandals, no questionable behaviors, not even a traffic ticket. It's as if she had lived intentionally so she could withstand any scrutiny." But the real revelation came when Richard's legal team presented their counterattack. Instead of simply defending themselves, they decided to go on the offensive, exposing exactly what type of family was trying to take a child from his mother. Richard's investigators had been equally thorough, but in the opposite direction. What they discovered about the Whitmore family created a case that even the most skilled lawyer couldn't defend. Decades of systematic discrimination on their properties, employment policies that deliberately excluded minorities, charitable donations that carefully avoided any cause related to civil rights. More damaging still, they found evidence that Harrison Whitmore had been involved in a similar scandal 20 years earlier, when a domestic employee had been fired after accusing Harrison of sexual harassment. The woman had been silenced with a financial agreement, but Richard's investigators had located the sealed documents. "They want to talk about moral fitness," Richard declared during a press conference that surprised all sides. "Let's talk about a family that has used their wealth for generations to silence women they've abused, to maintain systems of discrimination, and that now wants to use those same methods to separate a child from his mother." It was a risky move, turning a private custody battle into a public spectacle. But Richard had correctly calculated that public opinion, in an era of greater awareness about social justice, wouldn't side with an aristocratic family trying to take a baby from a young mother based on barely disguised racial prejudices. The media seized the story like hungry lions. Oil magnate fights for interracial son, custody battle exposes decades of discrimination, love versus privilege in the courts. Each headline, each article, each television segment built the narrative framework Richard had hoped for. A powerful man finally doing the right thing versus an aristocratic family clinging to prejudices of the past. Public pressure began tilting the scales. Peaceful protests appeared in front of Whitmore properties. Civil rights organizations offered pro bono legal support to Amara. Celebrities began expressing public support for Richard's courage in choosing love over social convenience. But the decisive moment came during Amara's testimony before the court. For 3 hours, she faced the most brutal interrogation the Whitmore's lawyers could design and emerged not only intact, but radiant. "Why didn't you contact Mr. Blackstone when you discovered your pregnancy?" the Whitmore's lead attorney asked, his voice loaded with insinuations. "Because he had returned to a world where I didn't exist," Amara responded with clear voice. "Because a pregnant black servant telling a white millionaire he's going to be a father. sounds exactly like the type of trap you're describing. Because I wanted to protect my son from becoming the center of exactly this type of media circus. So you admit you intentionally concealed the child's existence? I protected my son from being seen as a mistake or a shame. I raised him with love, dignity, and hope that someday his father would be ready to love him as he deserves to be loved. And how did you know that day would come? Amara looked directly into Richard's eyes, who was seated in the front row, and smiled with a serenity that illuminated the entire courtroom. Because true love always finds its way home. The court declared a recess, but Richard knew the battle had already been won, not by lawyers or legal strategies, but by the simple and incontrovertible force of a truth that no sophisticated argument could defeat. Judge Martha Williams delivered her ruling 3 days later in a courtroom packed with reporters, civil rights activists, and curious onlookers who had followed every development of the case. The Honorable Judge Williams, a 60-year-old African-American woman with a reputation for impeccable judicial wisdom, had studied every piece of evidence, every testimony, every legal precedent that could influence her decision. "In my 30 years presiding over this court," she began with firm voice, "I have rarely seen a case where the real motivations of the parties were so transparently clear. This is not a case about parental fitness or child welfare. This is a case about power, privilege, and prejudice disguised as legal concern." Her words cut through the air like sharpened swords. The Whitmore's lawyers became visibly tense, while Richard felt hope blooming in his chest like a rose after rain. The evidence presented demonstrates overwhelmingly that David Washington is a loved, well-cared-for and thriving child under his mother's care. There exists no credible evidence of negligence, abuse, or parental incapacity. Miss Washington has proven to be a dedicated, intelligent, and moral mother. The judge turned toward Richard with a look that seemed to see directly through his soul. As for Mr. Blackstone, his transformation during this process has been remarkable. I have observed many parents fight for their children in this courtroom, but rarely have I seen someone willing to risk so much personally and professionally for the right to love his child publicly. Tears ran freely down Amara's cheeks as she held David, who had remained mysteriously silent during the entire proceeding, as if sensing the importance of the moment. "Therefore," the judge continued, "this court completely rejects the plaintiff's lawsuit. David Washington will remain under the full custody of his mother, Amara Washington. Furthermore, this court officially recognizes Mr. Richard Blackstone's paternity and orders that the minor's birth certificate be amended to reflect his full surname as David Washington Blackstone." The roar of approval that followed was so loud that bailiffs had to intervene to maintain order. Richard rose from his seat as if floating, walked to where Amara held David, and for the first time in public, embraced his family without caring who was watching. "But there is one more condition," Judge Williams added, raising her hand to silence the celebration. "This court orders that both parents participate in family mediation sessions to establish a shared parenting plan that serves the minor's best interests. This child deserves to have both parents actively involved in his life." It was more than Richard had dared dream possible. Not only had he won the legal right to be David's father, but a court of justice had publicly validated his decision to choose love over social conventions. As they left the courthouse amid camera flashes and shouted questions from reporters, Richard felt he was walking toward a completely new life. The Whitmores had disappeared through a back exit, defeated not only legally, but morally exposed before the entire world. "What comes next?" Amara asked while protecting David from the media chaos surrounding them. Richard looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something that hadn't been present during their night of passion a year ago. The absolute certainty of a man who finally knew exactly what he wanted from life. "Now," he said with a smile that completely transformed his face, "we begin building the life David deserves, together." Richard Blackstone's transformation didn't end with the court's verdict. It had barely begun. In the weeks following the legal battle, he embarked on a process of personal reconstruction that was as radical as any corporate restructuring he had ever directed. The first change was physical and symbolic. He sold his Manhattan penthouse, that tower of glass and steel that had been his fortress of solitude for decades. In its place, he bought a family home on the city's outskirts, with spacious gardens where David could play, rooms filled with natural light, and enough space for a family to grow and thrive. "Are you sure about this?" Amara asked as they toured the property for the first time. It was a beautiful but modest house, compared to the properties Richard usually frequented, designed for family comfort rather than social prestige. "More sure than I've been of any decision in my life," he replied, watching David crawl across the green grass, fascinated by butterflies dancing among wildflowers. But the deepest changes were occurring in Richard's professional priorities. He began delegating more operational responsibilities to trusted partners, reserving his personal attention for aspects of his business that truly passionate him: renewable energy development, environmental responsibility programs, and, surprisingly, social justice initiatives within the oil industry. "I've spent decades extracting resources from the earth," he confided to Amara one night, while David slept between them in the giant bed they had improvised for nights when the baby had nightmares. "I want to spend the rest of my life giving something back to the world my son will inherit." He established educational foundations specifically designed for students from marginalized communities. He created scholarship programs bearing David's name, ensuring other children facing similar barriers would have opportunities their birth circumstances might deny them. He invested millions in clean technology research, not for potential profits, but because he wanted David to grow up in a more sustainable world. The relationship between Richard and Amara also evolved during these months of intensive coexistence. What had begun as a night of forbidden passion had transformed into something much deeper and complex. A partnership based on mutual love, profound respect, and shared commitment to raising David with values both had learned through their personal struggles. It wasn't a path without obstacles. They had to navigate cultural differences their respective backgrounds had created, conflicting social expectations, the outside world projected onto their relationship, and personal insecurities that years of separate lives had carved into their hearts. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living in a dream," Amara admitted one afternoon while watching Richard teach David to take his first steps in the garden. "Like I'm going to wake up and discover none of this is real." "I used to have the same feeling," Richard responded, "but in the opposite sense. I felt my previous life was the dream, an elaborate performance where I played the role of a successful man while inside I was completely empty. Us, David. This is the most real thing I've ever experienced." When David turned 1, they organized a celebration that perfectly symbolized what their family had come to represent. They invited employees from all of Richard's companies, neighbors from the new house, teachers from the school where Amara had decided to study pedagogy in evening hours, and civil rights activists who had supported them during the legal battle. It was an impossible mixture of social classes, races, ages, and backgrounds that under normal circumstances would never have shared the same space. But united by love for David and respect for the unconventional family Richard and Amara had built, they created a community that transcended all traditional barriers. "Look at that child," Richard said during the impromptu toast, holding David in his arms while the baby tried to grab champagne bubbles floating in the air. "A year and a half ago, I was a man who believed success was measured in bank figures. David has taught me that true wealth is measured in laughter, in sleepless nights voluntarily chosen, in the privilege of being the first face he sees when he wakes up and the last he sees before sleeping." His words were received with sincere applause, but it was Amara who offered the reflection everyone would remember for years. "David represents something greater than our personal story," she said with the natural eloquence she had developed during months of public speaking about social justice issues. "He is living proof that love can overcome any barrier society constructs. That family is defined by commitment and affection, not by conventions, that the future will be brighter than the past, because there are children like him growing up without the limitations their parents had to overcome." As stars appeared in the night sky and guests began saying goodbye, Richard found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey he had lived. He had begun as a lonely magnate seeking temporary refuge in a rural mansion, and had become a father, a partner, and surprisingly an activist for causes he had never thought about before meeting Amara. "Do you have any regrets?" Amara asked that night as they put David to bed in his new room, decorated with mobiles that projected stars on the ceiling and shelves filled with books in 3 different languages. Richard considered the question seriously. He had lost some business partners who couldn't accept his new life. His relationship with his biological family would probably never fully recover. He had spent millions on legal battles and had sacrificed business opportunities that could have increased his fortune considerably. "My only regret," he said finally, "is that it took me 32 years to find what really matters in life. But I suppose David arrived exactly when I was ready to be the father he deserved." Amara smiled and snuggled against him as they watched David sleep peacefully. "Maybe that's the most important lesson we can teach him, that it's never too late to choose love over fear, truth over convenience, family over fame." Richard nodded, feeling a deep peace that had been absent from his life for decades. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: business meetings to balance with baby feeding schedules, corporate decisions to consider through the lens of what kind of world he was creating for his son, continued navigation of a relationship that defied all social expectations. But tonight, in this room filled with love and possibilities, Richard Blackstone was simply a father, watching his son sleep, planning the bright future they would build together. 3 years had passed since that transformative night at Whitmore Manor, and the world had watched with growing fascination the continued evolution of the Blackstone Washington family. David, now a 4-year-old with his father's insatiable curiosity and his mother's early emotional wisdom, had involuntarily become a symbol of hope for non-traditional families across the country. Richard's transformation had continued in ways even he hadn't anticipated. His company, rebranded as Blackstone Sustainable Futures, had pivoted completely toward renewable energy, becoming one of the world leaders in solar and wind technology. But more importantly, he had established a business model that prioritized social responsibility as much as financial profits. "Dad, why do some kids at the park ask me why my mum and dad don't look alike?" David asked one afternoon while they built a sandcastle on their new coastal home's private beach. Richard stopped, carefully considering his response. These teaching moments had come earlier than he'd expected, but David had the right to understand his place in the world. "Because some people still don't understand that families come in many different forms," Richard replied, sitting at his son's eye level. "Your mom and I come from different places with different stories, but we fell in love and decided to create something beautiful together. Like when you mix different colors and get a new color?" David asked, always seeking analogies he could understand. "Exactly like that," Richard smiled. "You're our new color, the most beautiful we've ever seen." Amara, who had been listening from the terrace while preparing snacks, felt her heart fill with pride. Richard had developed a naturalness for fatherhood that constantly surprised her, as if he had been practicing for this role his entire life without knowing it. David's education had become a joint project, reflecting the values both parents wanted to transmit. He attended an experimental school Richard had helped found, where children from all socio-economic backgrounds learned together, where diversity was celebrated as strength, and where critical thinking was valued as much as traditional academic performance. "We want David to grow up understanding that his privilege comes with responsibilities," Amara explained during an interview for a documentary about interracial families being filmed by a national network. "But we also want him to know his identity isn't limited by others' expectations about what he should be based on his appearance or family history." The impact of their story had resonated far beyond their personal lives. Richard had established the David Blackstone Foundation, providing free legal support to single mothers facing custody battles, especially those confronting racial or socio-economic discrimination. They had helped win dozens of cases similar to theirs, establishing legal precedents protecting non-traditional families' rights. Amara had completed her master's in early childhood education and written a book about conscious parenting that had become a national bestseller. Building Bridges, A Mother's Lessons on Love Without Borders, had touched a nerve in a society struggling with questions of identity, belonging, and changing definitions of family. "Love knows no colors, recognizes no social classes, respects no artificial borders," she had written in the final chapter. "When we choose to love authentically, We create ripples that extend far beyond our individual lives, touching hearts we'll never know, and healing wounds we didn't know existed. But perhaps the most significant change had been in Richard himself. The man who once measured success exclusively in terms of market dominance and wealth accumulation now found his greatest satisfaction in simple moments, teaching David to ride a bicycle, reading bedtime stories, explaining how stars work during clear nights in the garden. "Do you know when I knew I had completely changed?" he confided to Amara one night while watching David sleep after a particularly adventure-filled day. "When?" she asked, snuggling against him in the reading chair they had placed in David's room for nights when he needed extra company. "When I realized I preferred being here, in this room, watching our son sleep, than closing the biggest deal of my career. When I understood this silence filled with love was more valuable than all the applause from boardrooms worldwide." Amara smiled, remembering the nervous and emotionally closed man she had met that first night in the library. "Sometimes I think David didn't just change us as individuals, but changed our understanding of what's possible when people allow themselves to love without restrictions." It was a profound reflection that had become the central theme of motivational talks Richard had begun giving at universities and business conferences. His story had inspired other executives to reconsider their own priorities, other parents to fight more courageously for their families, other interracial couples not to let fear dictate their decisions. "True leadership," he had said during his keynote address at Harvard Business School, "isn't about building empires that outlive you. It's about raising human beings who make the world a more loving and just place. All the money in the world is useless if you don't have someone for whom you want to create a better future." His words had been quoted in national newspapers, but for Richard, what mattered most was that David grew up understanding these values, not as abstract lessons, but as the lived reality of his family. One afternoon, while David played in the garden with other neighborhood children, a wonderfully diverse group including kids from traditional families, single-parent families, adoptive families, and families with two dads or two moms, Richard found himself reflecting on the legacy he was creating. "What are you thinking about?" Amara asked, following his gaze toward the group of children playing without caring about differences adults might notice. "That David is growing up in a world we helped create," Richard replied. "A world where love matters more than appearances, where family is defined by commitment and not convention, where children can be exactly who they are without apologizing for their history." It was true. The battle they had fought hadn't been just for their right to be a family, but for the right of all non-traditional families to exist without shame, to thrive without justifications, to love without limitations imposed by others. As stars began appearing in the evening sky and David ran toward them with arms extended for his traditional nightly hug, Richard felt gratitude so deep it almost overwhelmed him. It had taken him more than 3 decades to find his true purpose, but now he knew with absolute certainty that every painful decision, every battle fought, every sacrifice made had been worth it for this moment, being part of a family built on unconditional love and unbreakable truth. "I love you, Dad," David murmured against his neck during the embrace, simple words that had replaced all the professional praise Richard had pursued for decades. "And I love you, my little hero," Richard responded, knowing these were the only words that truly mattered. Tonight, like every night for the past 3 years, Richard Blackstone would go to sleep not as a lonely magnate in a glass tower, but as a father and partner in a house filled with love, laughter, and the bright promise of all the tomorrows they would build together. And so, dear friends, we reach the end of a story that began with a powerful man's return to a mansion full of secrets, and ends with the understanding that true power resides in the capacity to love unconditionally, to choose truth over convenience, and to build legacies that transcend bank accounts and properties. The story of Richard, Amara, and David reminds us that sometimes the greatest treasures are found not in bank vaults, but in the arms of those we choose to love. That true wealth isn't measured in figures but in shared moments, in laughter that fills rooms, in hugs that heal wounds we didn't know we had. David Blackstone Washington grew up to become a young man who carried in his veins not only the blood of 2 seemingly irreconcilable worlds, but the wisdom that love can build bridges where others see only chasms. His very existence became living testimony that when two people dare to love each other authentically, regardless of barriers society constructs, they can create something more beautiful than either could have achieved alone. Richard never regretted trading his Manhattan penthouse for a family home filled with noise and life. He never lamented choosing nights of children's stories over gala dinners with other magnates. He never doubted his decision to risk his reputation for the right to love his son publicly, without shame, without apologies. Amara became more than David's mother. She transformed into a powerful voice for social justice, a defender of marginalized families, a living example that dignity cannot be bought or sold, only lived day by day with unwavering integrity. Together they created something neither business books nor social etiquette manuals had predicted. A family that challenged all expectations and, in doing so, expanded the very definitions of what's possible when love guides life's most important decisions. Whitmore Manor, where it all began, was eventually converted into a family retreat center for adoptive parents and multicultural families, a place where other unconventional love stories could develop without the weight of social judgment. The gardens where Amara once worked as domestic help now bloomed with the sound of children of all colors playing together, unaware of the artificial barriers previous generations had considered insurmountable. If this story has touched your heart, if you felt the thrill of seeing love triumph over prejudice, if you found hope in the transformation of a man who chose to be a father above being powerful, then you have the opportunity to be part of something greater. Subscribe to continue discovering stories that celebrate the courage to love authentically. Share this story with someone who needs to remember it's never too late to choose love over fear. Leave your comment about which part of this story resonated most deeply with you. Was it Amara's courage facing motherhood alone? Richard's transformation from magnate to dedicated father? Or perhaps the way David became a symbol of hope for families that dare to be different? Because in a world that often seems divided by superficial differences, stories like this remind us of a fundamental truth. True love knows no borders, and when we dare to follow our hearts instead of our fears, we can create miracles that transform not only our own lives, but the world we leave for, our children. Sometimes the real treasure isn't in the millionaire's accounts, but in the son born of love and truth, and in the family they decided to build together against all odds. May this story be a reminder that each of us has the power to choose love over convention, truth over comfort, and real family over false expectations. Because at the end of the day, when lights go out and masks come off, the only thing that truly matters is whether we've had the courage to love and be loved without conditions. This is the true inheritance Richard Blackstone left his son. Not millions of dollars or vast properties, but absolute certainty that he was loved, valued, and celebrated exactly as he was. And that, dear friends, is wealth no economic crisis can steal, no scandal can tarnish, and no time can diminish. Love won. Truth triumphed. And somewhere a child sleeps peacefully, knowing he is exactly who he's supposed to be. Subscribe, share, and help us continue telling stories that remind us of humanity's best.